just because it seemed like you were more of a representative of that community, right? Because there's a huge South Asian population in your township, right? So they probably felt more comfortable, and they thought that maybe their concerns would resonate with you more.
Right.
And that brings you back to the point that if you want to help, you have to be there to be in a position to be able to help. Because if you're not their representative and they have that majority white male population as their representative, their voice may not be heard.
Right.
So that's actually really helpful for the community. The other thing that while I was researching you, that came up was that you teach feminism and secularism through the lens of Islam and pertaining to women, and that's also a very, very unique topic. How does that gel in with what you're doing over here?
Yeah, well, I think I am all about questioning some of the received narratives that we have, and as you and I were discussing, after September 11th, there were the messages saying, well, this is what Islam is. Right. Muslims are violent, and they, want a certain type of politics. And the more that I research the breadth of Islamic society and history, you learn about the significance of the arts, and that, Muslim societies had very much of a tendency to be humanistic and inclusive. And especially when you look at Islam in South Asia, the way in which, Muslim rulers in India dealt with religious diversity is actually something that Europeans were like, oh, that's an interesting example. They seem to accept the differences there. And then in the modern period as well, not every, Muslim thinker has wanted religion and politics to be closely linked. There have been, secular thinkers, and there have been activists who have wanted a separation between religion and politics from the Muslim community as well. But for some reason, they're discounted, or we just don't study them as much. So I wanted to bring attention to that, first to the role and the significance of arts and culture in Muslim societies, and then also to this diversity of thought. That yes, there are those political movements in Muslim societies that have wanted religion and politics to be very enmeshed, but there's also those who haven't.
Right.
And so we have to understand all of those possibilities to really get a broad and accurate representation of what's possible in Muslim societies.
Because you're right, secularism is an entirely foreign concept in Muslim politics. It's not something that's readily accepted and even talked about. So I thought that was very interesting to bring that into mix and actually make it, the population aware, or your students aware that such a thought process actually exists.
Right.
Yeah.
And it has historical precedence. It's not, secularism is a system that was developed in a global conversation, and Muslim societies were very much a part of that conversation.
Right.
It's not that it was developed somewhere else and then exported, because actually the types of, fundamentalism that we see in Muslim societies today, that's also a modern construct. So to say that, well, this political system is, we're all living in modernity. So there's nothing more authentic or ancient or Islamic about wanting a certain type of mix of religion and politics than there is to want a separation.
True. But I'm glad, people like you are bringing such concepts and making public aware of them, that they exist. And I think that speaks to the whole narrative of, changing the perspective of Islam, getting rid of Islamophobia and all that. I see you also talk about political cynicism, because again, there is also in the modern era or recent years, there's this narrative that people are maybe running away from politics. They don't think it's the best way to serve the people because they don't think they can actually get to do what they want to do. So what's your take on that?
Well, I would say that the vast majority of us, we have an appreciation for democracy, right? We didn't want to be colonized by, Europeans, either in South Asia or in the United States. We wanted to have self-rule, to have representation, to have a government that was by the people, by our peers. And so I think if you value democracy, then you can't hate all politics and you can't hate all of those who serve in public service.
True.
Because the two go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other.
Right.
And actually, I think pervasive cynicism serves the worst actors, because then they can say, oh, everyone is terrible. So just let me, I'm no worse than they are. So you might as well just ignore what I'm doing and let me do what I want. And so I think actually it's very dangerous when we start to accept that. Like, oh, just write off politics. Everyone who's involved is terrible. I think, the vast majority of people that I've worked with in public service are trying to do the right thing. They want to serve their communities. They're in it because they care. Because it is honestly a sacrifice in so many different ways.
Yeah, I would think so.
So I think I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism, but pervasive cynicism where you think everything is terrible and there's no help is actually counterproductive. And it's not even accurate, because so many people have fought and died for us to have these rights, to have political rights.
Yeah.
And so we should respect those sacrifices that were made and participate and make the change that we can. We should appreciate the rights that we do have. And yes, things could be better. There are definitely problems, but we can't write it all off as, oh, it's just, it's as horrible as it can be. No, it could, if we allow our democracies to collapse, it could be much worse. And so it's important.
And I think that stands true for all institutions of life. It's just not pertinent only to politics, right? There's good and bad everywhere. And if you want to change, you can't do it by standing on the sidelines. You have to become a part of the process to help the process along. During this whole journey, have you experienced backlash? Have you been targeted for doing what you do?
Yeah, I think unfortunately I have, and a lot of the negativity does mostly focus on being a Muslim elected official and fear that people have, or just hate that they have towards Muslims, and then to some degree as well, being of an immigrant background or being a racial minority also makes some people upset when they see leaders from minority backgrounds. And then on a third level, I think that there is a lot of hostility towards women in politics, and we're treated a little bit differently, or we're thought of a little bit more negatively than men. So all of those compound.
Triple whammy.
Yes, and I have dealt with that. So, it's unfortunate. I think it'll change over time as people's idea of what a leader looks like changes, and they get more used to it. And when we have more people, because when there's a few, all of that attention, negative is focused. And I think as you see more people, it'll just become normal. And I hope that, future generations won't have to face that sort of intense negative attention.
So despite the hardship that you've dealt with or the backlash that you've faced, you would still advocate for more participation from minorities, from women, from people of color, from different religions. So, the representation increases, right? It hasn't put you off. It hasn't turned you off. And you wouldn't, let's say if you were to advocate for it to your child, you would still advocate for it.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, decided not to seek re-election this year. So it's a decision that I made to some degree based on some of the challenges that I faced.
Okay.
But I'm still staying involved. I actually just became the chair of my local Democratic Party in my town, and I'm helping other candidates run. So I think, I would never demand it of people that, you have to run.
Yeah.
Because yes, there are sacrifices. Yes, it can be a struggle. And each one of us has to check in with, our willingness, our ability, our personal responsibilities. But I think if anybody has an inclination,
you would be supportive.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, as I mentioned, the more people who get involved, the easier it'll be, and will become a support system. And, I think we can think of it in the sense of like the first generation of women to maybe go to college, or, the first generation of even South Asian doctors in this country. Now there's so many, but like at a certain time when it was in the early days, there wouldn't have been many, and it would have been very difficult. So I think you have to kind of build the norms and the networks and the support systems. And I think that will come with time. But, I think it's definitely a worthwhile exercise, and it only will serve everyone, better. If we know the needs of the community, if you can advocate. One of the questions that I often get is it better to be within the system or outside the system? And my answer to that is you need both.
Yeah.
You need those advocates who are very passionate, who are very knowledgeable, who are pushing things in the, good direction. But then you also need those people who are in positions of power, who are friendly to your cause,
yes.
who understand and who want to be the people who are going to propose legislation and support legislation. So, everybody has their own desires and their own skill sets and comfort levels, but we need people on all sides of governance and policy making and advocacy if we want to move things in a good direction.
Yeah.